So now let's talk about outliers. We'll get to this in a minute, but first of all, some terminology. There are two different types of outliers. The first we've already talked about this semester, and that's the idea of a univariate outlier. That is an outlier where there is something different on one of their responses. What I've graphed out, if you remember earlier this semester, we used the example of, let's say I wanted to take a poll of my students and have them keep track of how many hours they worked every week. And at the end of the semester, I was going to add up their average number of hours worked and their class and their semester GPA. And let's say I had a student in the class that was a physician that was wanting to do some analysis of his patient files. And so he was retaking like a research methods class and a stats class and things like that. And that was the idea of a univariate outlier, right? Because I might have, if I've made this plot of my students' work hours and their GPAs, and pretty much all the students in my sample are working from 5 to 40 hours a week, and then, I have Dr. Gray over here that his average ended up being like 85 hours a week all the way over here. He's an outlier. He's a univariate outlier. It is unusual in my sample to have somebody with that number. And we had talked about way back at the beginning of the semester how we would use z-scores to calculate that. So it's a univariate outlier. It's something about that response is unusual. And we'll talk in a little bit about how we handle that with correlations. But there's another type of outlier I want to introduce you to. And that's the idea of sometimes it's just called a bivariate outlier and sometimes it's called a multivariate outlier. But the idea here is the score that they have on something is not necessarily unusual, but the combination of their two scores is unusual. I will give you an example from some research that I've done personally. I've mentioned a couple of times in the discussion boards that for a while I did quite a bit of research on unintended pregnancy among younger women. One of the data sets that I was working with had sampled young women from age 16 up until about age 28, I believe, who had experienced an unintended pregnancy. Now, it was not unusual to have a 16, 17-year-old who had had an unintended pregnancy. There was nothing unusual about that in the data set. It was also not unusual to have one of the older participants who was 27, 28 years old to report having had 3 unintended pregnancies. It happened. Sometimes it happens more than once. That is what it is. That's what the research shows us. However, there was one participant in that data set that at age 17 had reported 3 unintended pregnancies. That was statistically unusual. Nothing unusual about a 17-year-old reporting an unintended pregnancy in that data set. Nothing unusual about 3 unintended pregnancies being reported if you were looking at the whole sample. However, that combination of I am 16 and have had 3 unintended pregnancies was considered a bivariate outlier or a multivariate outlier. It's not a combination of variables that we saw really anywhere else in this data. Another example, let's say we were doing a survey and we were looking at traditional full-time day school students between ages 18 and 22, and we were wanting to do a correlation between their yearly income and their stress levels, right? So maybe we're trying to say that the balance of being a full-time student and trying to work enough to have spending money and meet your needs and all that, and how does that combine? I actually personally knew somebody who had very wealthy grandparents who had passed away. And the way the grandparents had set up the trust fund was from age 21 to 25, this individual got $100,000 a year from the trust fund and then got the remainder after they turned 26, I believe was how it was set up. We were all very, very jealous of this person. But so if we were looking at our population of students, it wouldn't necessarily be unusual. Let me take out the restriction of full-time day school students. Let's consider all students. If we were looking at all students, it might not be unusual to have a student that is making a six-figure salary, right? Maybe somebody who has a good job and is doing continuing education or something like that. So that might not, if we just run our z-scores, someone with a $100,000 a year salary, I apologize for my loud dog, if we were to run our z-scores, a student in our data set with a $100,000 a year salary might not automatically show up as an outlier. If we were to run our z-scores, a student who's 21 years old would by no means show up as an outlier. However, that combination of I have a 21-year-old full-time student who has an income of $100,000 a year, that combination is unusual. It's not something that we tend to see. Your textbook gives the example of widows, right? If you were to do a data set and you were to look at marital status and age, and it was saying, not unusual to have widows in a data set. People's spouses die. It happens, unfortunately. Wouldn't it be unusual to have young participants in a data set if you had opened it up to everybody? However, if you have an 18-year-old widow, that's a rather unusual situation. That's not something you see a lot. So that's the idea of a bivariate or a multivariate outlier. It's not the individual scores by themselves that are outliers or that are unusual. It's the combination of these two scores once you put them together that combination is unusual. There are statistical tests that can detect for these that are outside of the realm of this class. But just so you know, there are ways that we can look at this in the statistics. And if we do a scatter plot, which is always a great first step of correlations, a lot of times they become easy to spot on the scatter plot. So let me show you an example of both of these and how Pearson's row can, actually, first let's talk about what we do with them. As we're talking, because I know that was a follow-up question before of, okay, so you have an outlier, what do you do? Do you run your data anyway? Do you get rid of it? And a lot of it depends on what your topic of interest for research is. So like the example I gave with the unintended pregnancy, I was specifically interested in looking at mental health effects following an unintended pregnancy. Like the coping of it, the processing, whether the person decided to enter into parenthood or terminate the pregnancy, the mental health of having experienced an unintended life transition. So because of that, in that case, I did not include, I excluded from my data set, I excluded from my analysis that participant who had 3 unintended pregnancies by age 17. Because if I'm looking at mental health, you would have to assume that there was probably some other mental health factors in this young woman's life, that she had experienced 3 pregnancies by age 17. Similarly, if I was going to come over here and do a correlation between work hours and GPA, if I was going to do a Spearman's row with this, which one of the benefits of a Spearman's row is these univariate outliers, like this one guy over here that's working 90 hours a week, instead of now being over here at 90 hours a week, if I'm rank ordering them, yeah, he's going to be the highest rank in terms of numbers worked. But again, if I have 100 participants and I have this from 1 to 100, now he's over here in line neatly on 1 to 100 instead of being way out here in his own little world. So that is one of the benefits of the Spearman's row, is it allows us to pull in some of those outliers in a way that considers them fairly, since you're now ranking them instead of using their raw scores. And so for him, I might want to keep him in there, even though he's not my typical student that I would see. I mean, that's still a valuable thing to analyze in the trend of hours worked and overall GPA. Now, multivariate outliers. Let's say that this is what this trend looked like. Okay, So I've graphed my numbers of hours worked and my average GPA, and I find kind of like this, where as work hours increase, GPA decreases, which I mean is pretty logical, right? If you work a full-time job, you do not have as much time to just sit and study. And so it might be harder to keep a super high GPA. We would still have a few over here, right? But our norm would be this trend that as numbers of hours worked goes down, numbers of hours worked goes down, the GPA also goes down. So a multivariate outlier might be if in this data set, which I know this doesn't happen, maybe this wasn't the best example to choose, but in this data set, if I had a student over here who was only working 5 hours a week, but had like a 2.3 GPA. Having a 2.3 GPA isn't unusual, right? I'm seeing that over here a lot. But it's unusual for where the rest of the participants who are only working 5 hours a week are landing. And I'm not saying that everyone who doesn't work a lot has a high GPA. Like I said, this probably wasn't the best example. And similarly with over here, maybe I have a student who's working 4 hours a week and has a 4.0 GPA. A 4.0 GPA isn't uncommon, right? I'm seeing it a lot on this side of my data. Working 40 hours a week isn't uncommon. I'm seeing it a lot here. But that combination of I'm working 40 hours a week and maintaining a 4.0 GPA while being a full-time student in this data set, this totally hypothetical data set, would be an unusual combination. And so if you had made a scatter plot, that makes it easy to see some of these multivariate outliers and where they might be landing. And again, I really don't mean this example to be offensive to anybody. There's lots of full-time employees who have amazing GPAs and lots of people who work part-time that still struggle in class. Like I please don't think I'm making any sort of personal statement with this. It probably was not the best example. But it does allow, to point out that if you use a scatter plot, which I'm going to show you how to do in PSPP, if you do a scatter plot, it can be a great starting point for looking at your data because you can very quickly identify if you have any of those multivariate outliers occurring, and you can very quickly identify if you have that curvilinear type of relationship going on, or if this is going to be a linear relationship that we can use. So the next video is going to actually get into PSPP, and we're going to look at how to do some of this.